They said he killed a man, and he nodded like it was the easiest truth he'd ever told. The sun hung low over Red Hollow, turning the dust in the air into something gold and heavy, the kind of light that made everything look honest even when it wasn't. And Ethan Cole stood in the center of it with his hat in his hands, shoulders squared but eyes quiet, like a man already walking away from something no one else could see. The townsfolk circled him at a distance of maybe 20 feet, boots planted in dry earth, whispers passing between them like wind through fence wire, each voice adding weight to a story that had already decided how it would end. And no one noticed how still Ethan was, not frozen, not afraid, just still in a way that comes when a man has made up his mind long before anyone asked him to speak. Sheriff Halvorsen stood on the wooden steps behind him, older now, the lines on his face cut deep by years and choices that never quite sat right, his hand resting near his belt but not touching it, because this wasn't that kind of moment, not yet, not unless someone pushed it there. And Ethan didn't push anything, didn't raise his voice, didn't even look at the man lying covered under a canvas sheet near the saloon door, just kept his gaze somewhere past the buildings, past the people, like he was measuring distance in miles instead of feet. The accusation had come quick, sharp, carried on the word of a single witness and the kind of evidence that felt too neat to question. His revolver found where it shouldn't be, his tracks leading where no one could explain them away. And still he said nothing, not when they first called his name, not when they laid it out in front of him, not even when someone in the crowd muttered that they always knew something was off about a man who kept to himself that long. A breeze moved through town, slow and dry, carrying the smell of leather and sun-warmed wood, brushing the edge of Ethan's coat as if trying to turn him around. But he didn't move, only shifted his weight once, subtle, the kind of motion you'd miss if you blinked. And then Sheriff Halvorsen spoke, voice low but steady, asking the question that mattered, the one that could have changed everything if the answer had been different. And for a second, just a second, the whole town held its breath like it understood that whatever came next would settle deeper than law, deeper than proof. Ethan lifted his head then, not much, just enough for the light to catch his face. And there was no anger there, no fear either, just something tired and certain. The look of a man who had already paid a price no one else knew about. And when he spoke, it wasn't loud, didn't need to be, because silence had already made room for it. Write it down, he said, calm as a man ordering a drink. I did it. And the words landed heavier than any shout could have, heavier than the heat pressing down on the town, because they ended the argument before it ever began. And just like that, the story closed around him, tight and final. While somewhere beyond the edge of Red Hollow, the road stretched out in miles of dust and quiet, waiting for a man who would leave behind his name and take something else with him, something no one there would understand until it was far too late. By the time the crowd began to drift apart, Ethan Cole had already become something else in their minds, not a man they had known for years, not the quiet deputy who fixed broken fences without being asked or rode 12 miles out of town just to return a lost horse. But a story they could carry home, something simple enough to repeat over supper without thinking too hard about it. And that was how Red Hollow worked. It turned people into stories the moment they stopped fitting the shape everyone expected. Ethan did not argue as Sheriff Halvorsen stepped down from the porch, boots creaking against the old wood, the older man stopping just a few feet away, close enough to see the dust settled into the lines of Ethan's face. Close enough to remember the night years ago when this same man had dragged him out of a flooded ravine and said nothing about it after, like it had not mattered, like saving a life was just another chore before sundown. And now that same silence stood between them again, heavier this time, harder to carry. You understand what this means, Halvorsen said, not asking, just placing the words down careful and slow, and Ethan gave a small nod, barely there. The kind of motion that could have been missed if the wind had picked up, but the wind held back, as if even it wanted to hear what would not be said. There would be no trial, not here, not with the town already decided, and there would be no rope either, not today, because Halvorsen still had enough authority left to choose a quieter ending, one that did not leave a mark. In the center of town, so the choice was made in that silence, exile instead of spectacle, distance instead of finality. And Ethan accepted it the same way he had accepted everything else, without resistance, Without question, like a man following a path he had already walked in his mind. He turned then, slow and deliberate, and walked toward the hitching post where his horse waited, a lean bay with a white mark along its nose. The animal shifting once as if it felt the weight of the moment, even if it could not understand it. And Ethan rested his hand against its neck for a second longer than necessary, fingers pressing lightly into the warm hide, grounding himself in something that did not ask questions, something that did not need answers. A few townspeople watched from a distance of 30 or 40 feet, their voices lowered now, not out of respect, but because the ending had already been written and there was nothing left to argue about, and Ethan moved through them without looking up, not avoiding them, not acknowledging them, just passing through like a shadow that had lost its source. When he reached the saddle, he did not climb up right away. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small piece of cloth, folded twice, worn at the edges, and for a brief moment his eyes rested on it, something unreadable passing through them, something too quiet for anyone else to catch. And then it was gone as he tucked it back inside, hidden again where no one would think to look. Sheriff Halvorsen watched him from the porch, the old man's jaw tightening just enough to show that something in this did not sit right. But he said nothing, because sometimes the weight of a truth is not in proving it, but in knowing when to leave it buried. And Ethan seemed to understand that better than anyone there. The horse shifted again as Ethan finally mounted, leather creaking, dust lifting in a soft cloud beneath its hooves. And for a moment, just before he turned toward the road leading out of Red Hollow, he paused, not looking back at the town, not searching for anyone in particular, just pausing like a man measuring the distance between who he had been and what he was about to become. And then with a light pull of the reins, he rode forward, the sound of hoofbeats steady and unhurried, carrying him past the last row of buildings, past the edge where the ground opened into miles of dry land and empty sky. And no one there noticed that he did not once look behind him, not because he did not care, but because whatever truth he carried with him did not belong to Red Hollow anymore. The road out of Red Hollow stretched for miles without a single tree tall enough to cast a full shadow, just low scrub and dry earth that cracked under the afternoon heat, and Ethan Cole rode through it at a steady pace, neither rushing nor slowing, as if the distance behind him did not matter and the distance ahead had already been decided. The town faded quickly, first the buildings, then the sound, then the memory of voices, until all that remained was the rhythm of hooves against dirt and the quiet weight of open land pressing in from every side. The kind of silence that does not feel empty but full, like it is holding something back, waiting. Ethan did not look around much, did not scan the horizon the way most riders would when traveling alone, because he was not searching for danger or direction. He was carrying something heavier than either, something that did not change no matter how far he rode. And every now and then his hand brushed against the inside of his coat, checking the small folded cloth still there, a habit more than a need, like a man making sure a wound has not reopened even when he knows it never closed to begin with. The sun climbed higher, pushing the temperature well past 90 degrees, and sweat darkened the collar of his shirt beneath the dust. But he did not stop, not for water, not for shade, not even when the horse slowed slightly under the heat. He just adjusted the reins and kept moving, mile after mile, until the land itself began to change, the flat stretch giving way to low rises and scattered rocks that broke the horizon into uneven lines. Somewhere around 15 miles out, he finally pulled the horse to a stop near a dry creek bed, the ground there packed harder, marked with old tracks that had long since lost their shape, and he sat still in the saddle for a moment, listening, not for voices or footsteps, but for something quieter, something only he seemed to expect. And when nothing came, he exhaled slowly, the sound barely louder than the wind brushing past. He dismounted then, boots hitting the ground with a soft thud, and led the horse a few steps toward the creek bed before tying the reins loosely to a low branch, giving the animal room to lower its head and rest. And only then did Ethan reach into his coat. Again, this time pulling out the folded cloth completely, unfolding it once, then again, revealing a simple handkerchief, white once, but now marked with faint stains that time had not fully erased, and in one corner, stitched in careful, uneven thread, a set of initials that did not belong to him. His eyes rested on it longer this time, not searching, not questioning, just remembering, and for a brief moment, the stillness around him shifted, like the past had stepped closer without making a sound. He crouched near the edge of the dry creek, fingers brushing against the dirt as if testing its weight, and then he placed the handkerchief down carefully on the ground beside him, not letting it go completely, just holding it there between his fingers, caught between keeping it and leaving it behind. The kind of decision that does not change anything on the outside but alters everything within. The wind picked up slightly, carrying a thin line of dust across the creek bed, and the cloth moved just enough to remind him how light it really was, how something so small could carry more than a man should have to bear, and Ethan closed his eyes for a second, not long, just enough to let the moment settle before folding the cloth again and slipping it back into his coat, the motion slow and deliberate, like sealing something away that was never meant to be opened. When he stood, there was no hesitation left in him, no pause in his movement, just the same steady rhythm as before, and as he untied the reins and pulled himself back into the saddle, the land ahead seemed no different than the land behind, wide, quiet, and unforgiving. Yet Ethan rode into it without looking back, because whatever truth followed him now did not need a witness, only distance. By late afternoon the heat began to ease, not by much, just enough to let the wind carry a cooler edge across the open land, and Ethan Cole followed a narrow trail that cut between low hills, the kind of path used by men who preferred not to be seen from a distance. The ground there marked with faint wagon ruts and the occasional horseshoe print pressed deep into the dust, old but not forgotten. He noticed them without looking directly, the way a man notices something important without wanting to draw attention to it, and he adjusted his course slightly, keeping the trail but riding along its edge, never fully committing to it, as if he understood that some roads carry more than direction, they carry intention. The sky stretched wide above him, pale blue fading into a soft amber near the horizon, and the light settled low, casting long shadows that moved with him, stretching ahead like quiet warnings. But Ethan did not slow, his posture steady in the saddle, his eyes forward, always forward, like a man who had already decided that whatever waited ahead would not be avoided. After another 10 miles or so, the land dipped gently into a shallow basin where a small abandoned structure stood alone, a weathered shack no more than 12 feet wide, its roof sagging slightly under years of sun and wind, the wood bleached almost gray, and beside it, a broken fence leaned at an angle that suggested it had not held anything in a long time. Ethan guided his horse toward it without hesitation, as if he had known it would be there, or at least known that something like it would be waiting along the way. He dismounted slowly, the leather of the saddle creaking as his weight shifted, and tied the reins loosely to a splintered post, giving the horse enough slack to move but not wander. Then he stood there for a moment, looking at the shack, not inspecting it for danger, not measuring its usefulness, just looking, like he was confirming a memory rather than discovering a place. The door hung slightly open, pushed just enough by the wind to create a soft, uneven creak that repeated every few seconds, and Ethan stepped closer, boots pressing into the dry dirt with a sound that seemed louder than it should have been in the stillness around him. And when he reached the doorway, he paused, one hand resting lightly against the frame, his fingers tracing the rough grain of the wood, as if grounding himself before stepping inside. The interior was dim, the light filtering through gaps in the boards and a small window no larger than a foot across, casting thin lines across the floor, and there was little inside, a broken chair, a narrow table, and a metal cup left on its side, the kind of place that had once meant something to someone and then slowly stopped mattering. Ethan moved through it quietly, not searching, not hurried, just present, his eyes taking in each detail without lingering, until he reached the far wall where a small nail stuck out at shoulder height, and there, without hesitation, he reached into his coat again, pulling out the folded handkerchief, holding it for a second as the light caught the stitching, those same unfamiliar initials standing out against the worn fabric, and then he hung it on the nail, the cloth settling there gently, swaying once in the faint draft before becoming still. He did not step back right away, did not admire the act or question it. He simply stood there, looking at it as if placing it there had shifted something inside him, not lighter, not heavier, just different, like a line had been drawn where none had existed before. And then, after a quiet moment that stretched just long enough to matter, he turned away, leaving the handkerchief behind without another glance, and walked back out into the fading light, the wind brushing past him again, carrying the same dry scent of dust and distance. And when he mounted his horse once more and guided it back toward the open land, there was no sign on his face of what had just been left behind, only the same steady calm, the same silence, and the same unspoken truth riding with him into the lengthening shadows. The last light of day slipped behind the hills as Ethan Cole rode on, the sky turning a deep shade of amber that bled slowly into blue, and the air cooled just enough to carry the faint scent of distant water, though none could be seen from where he was, only the suggestion of it, like a memory the land refused to give back fully. He did not rush to find shelter, did not search for a town or a fire, because men like him learned long ago how to rest without comfort and move without destination. And so he let the horse choose a slower pace, the steady rhythm of hooves soft against the dirt as the world around him settled into evening. Somewhere in the distance, a lone coyote called out, its voice stretching thin across the open space, answered by nothing, and Ethan listened without reacting, not because he did not hear it, but because he understood that some sounds were not meant to be answered. After another mile or two, the land rose slightly again, and from that higher ground he could see a faint glow far off to the west, maybe 20 miles away, too small to be a town, too steady to be a passing traveler. And he watched it for a moment, measuring it the way a man measures choices, not by distance alone, but by what they might cost. And then he turned away from it, guiding the horse in the opposite direction without hesitation, leaving whatever waited in that light untouched, unseen, and unneeded. The night came fully then, quiet and complete, the sky opening wide with stars that seemed closer than the ground beneath him. And Ethan finally pulled the horse to a stop near a cluster of low rocks that broke the wind just enough to make a difference. Not much, maybe 5 degrees cooler, but out here that was enough. He dismounted slowly, joints stiff from hours in the saddle, and loosened the reins, letting the horse lower its head and breathe easier. Then he moved to the rocks and sat down, back straight, hands resting loosely on his knees, not slouched, not relaxed, just still, like he had been all day. Like stillness was the only thing he trusted. For a long time he did not move, did not eat, did not drink, just watched the dark settle into itself. And if there were thoughts passing through him, they did not show, not in his face, not in his posture, because whatever he carried was not something that needed to be spoken, not even to himself. The wind shifted once, brushing across the rocks and carrying with it a faint trace of something different, something that did not belong to empty land. A hint of smoke, distant and thin, and Ethan's eyes lifted slightly, not sharply, just enough to acknowledge it. And for the first time since leaving Red Hollow, there was the smallest pause in his stillness, the kind that comes when a man recognizes that the road ahead might not stay empty. He did not stand right away, did not reach for anything. He only listened, letting the silence settle again around the faint scent, measuring it the same way he had measured everything else, calm, deliberate. And when the wind shifted once more and the scent faded back into nothing, he remained where he was, unmoved, as if deciding that whatever lay out there would come when it was ready, not before, and not because he went looking for it. Above him, the stars held their place, steady and indifferent, and Ethan Cole sat beneath them without fire, without company, and without turning back. A man who had left something behind and carried something forward, though no one, not even him, could yet see which one would weigh more by the time the road finally ended. The night did not pass so much as it settled deeper, the kind of darkness that did not move but pressed in, layer by layer, until even the smallest sound felt like it had weight. And Ethan Cole remained where he was against the low rocks, his posture unchanged, his breathing steady, as if sleep was something he could choose to ignore when the land around him felt unfinished. Sometime past midnight, when the air cooled enough to carry a sharper edge, the wind shifted again, not strong, just enough to bring back that same faint trace from before, smoke, distant but real, and this time it lingered a little longer, thin but persistent, like something that did not belong to chance. Ethan's eyes opened fully then, not startled, not tense, just aware, and he turned his head slightly toward the direction the scent came from, measuring it again, not with urgency, but with a kind of quiet precision, the way a man listens to something he has already decided matters. He stood slowly, boots pressing into the ground with a soft, deliberate sound, and moved to his horse, running a hand along its neck once, grounding himself before lifting the reins, and without hesitation, he mounted, guiding the animal toward the direction of that unseen fire, not because he needed to find it, but because something in him refused to leave it unanswered. The ride was slow at first, careful, the terrain uneven in the dark, rocks hidden in shadow, dips in the land that could catch a careless step, but Ethan moved through it with the same steady rhythm, letting the horse feel its way forward while his eyes adjusted to the shapes ahead. And after maybe 2 miles, the faint glow he had seen earlier began to return, no longer distant enough to ignore, a soft orange pulse against the horizon that rose and fell with the wind. He slowed then, pulling the reins gently, bringing the horse to a near stop behind a low ridge that gave just enough cover to observe without being seen, and from there, he could make out the source, a small camp, no more than one fire, and a wagon set slightly off to the side, its outline dark against the glow, and beside it, a single figure moving slowly, not pacing, not working, just moving like someone who had been awake too long and did not know what to do with the hours. Ethan did not approach right away, did not call out. He simply watched, his silhouette still against the ridge, his presence swallowed by the night. And for a long moment, nothing changed. The fire crackled softly, the figure shifted once, then again, and the land held its breath between them. Then the wind turned, carrying the sound of a voice, not loud, not clear, just enough to tell it was there, speaking into the empty space as if expecting no answer. And something in that sound, something fragile beneath its steadiness, made Ethan's grip on the reins tighten just slightly, not out of fear, but recognition. He waited a few seconds more, measuring the distance, the silence, the absence of any other movement, and then, finally, he nudged the horse forward, not fast, not hidden, just enough to let the sound of hooves carry ahead of him, announcing his presence without force, giving whoever waited by that fire time to turn, time to see him coming. Because Ethan Cole had never been a man who arrived without warning, even now, even here, even after everything he had left behind. The figure by the fire turned before Ethan Cole closed half the distance, not startled, not reaching for anything, just turning slowly as if the sound of approaching hooves had been expected long before it arrived. And in the low glow of the flames, the shape resolved into a woman, her posture straight despite the late hour, her hands empty and visible at her sides, the firelight catching in her hair and outlining the edges of her face in soft, shifting gold. Ethan brought his horse to a stop, about 30 feet away, far enough to show respect, close enough that words did not have to be raised. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them not tense but measured, like two people standing at the edge of something neither had named yet. The fire crackled quietly, sending a thin line of sparks upward before they disappeared into the night, and the wagon behind her stood still and worn, one wheel slightly tilted, canvas stretched tight but patched in places that suggested it had traveled farther than it should have. Ethan dismounted slowly, boots settling into the dirt with that same deliberate weight he carried in everything he did, and he kept his hands away from his belt, not as a gesture, but as a habit, the kind that had been shaped over years and never needed to be reconsidered. "Evening," he said, his voice low, steady, carrying just enough to reach her without breaking the quiet around them. And she nodded once, not smiling, not unfriendly, just acknowledging his presence like it had already been accounted for. "You came from the east," she said after a moment, her voice calm but edged with something observant, something that paid attention to details others missed, and Ethan glanced briefly in the direction he had ridden from, then back at her, giving a small nod that answered more than the words required. "Town back that way?" she asked, and there was no accusation in it, just a question placed carefully between them, and Ethan answered the same way he had answered everything since leaving Red Hollow, with as little as possible. "Was," he said, and the single word settled into the space between them, heavier than it sounded. She studied him for a second longer, her eyes moving not just across his face but over the dust on his coat, the way he stood, the way he carried. Stillness like it belonged to him. And then she stepped slightly to the side, gesturing toward the fire with a small movement of her hand, an invitation without insistence. Ethan hesitated for half a second, not out of doubt, but out of habit, measuring the moment the way he measured everything. And then he stepped forward, closing the distance with quiet, even strides until the warmth of the fire reached him, soft against the front of his coat, pushing back just enough of the night to make the space feel defined. He did not sit right away, instead standing near the edge of the light, his silhouette half caught between shadow and flame, and the woman turned back toward the fire, adjusting a small pot set near the coals, her movements precise, practiced, the kind that came from doing the same task too many times to count. "Water is warm," she said, not looking at him as she spoke. "Not much, but enough." And Ethan gave a slight nod, stepping closer and lowering himself onto a flat stone near the fire, his posture still straight, hands resting loosely on his knees, the same way he had sat alone hours earlier, except now the silence was shared. For a while, neither of them spoke again. The only sound the soft shift of embers and the distant whisper of wind moving across open land. And if there were questions waiting between them, neither reached for them, not yet, because some things, Ethan knew, did not reveal themselves when asked, only when given enough quiet to rise on their own. The warmth of the fire settled in slowly, not enough to chase away the night, but enough to soften its edge, and Ethan Cole sat without moving much, the faint glow reflecting in his eyes as he watched the coals shift and settle, each small movement of light and shadow playing across his face like something half-remembered. The woman moved with quiet purpose, pouring water from the small pot into a tin cup and setting it near him without ceremony, her hand steady, her attention returning to the fire as if the act of offering had already been accounted for long before he arrived. And Ethan reached for the cup after a moment, not hurried, not hesitant, just deliberate, lifting it with both hands and letting the warmth pass through his fingers before taking a slow sip, the heat grounding him in a way that the open road never could. For a while they stayed like that, sharing the same space without filling it, the silence between them no longer empty but layered, holding unasked questions and unspoken histories that neither seemed ready to disturb. And the fire became the center of it, a quiet witness that asked nothing and offered just enough. After some time, the woman spoke again, her voice low but clear, cutting through the stillness without breaking it. "You ride like you are not heading anywhere," she said, not accusing, not curious, just stating something she had already decided was true, and Ethan let the words settle before answering, his gaze still on the fire. "Maybe I am not," he replied, the simplicity of it carrying more weight than explanation ever could. She nodded slightly, as if that answer fit into something she already understood, and reached for a small piece of wood, placing it onto the fire with care, the flames catching slowly, rising just enough to cast new shadows across the ground, stretching them farther out into the night. "Most people ride towards something," she said after a moment, "or away from something." And this time Ethan looked up, his eyes meeting hers across the firelight, steady and unreadable. "Sometimes it is both," he said, and the words hung there, quiet but firm, like a truth that did not need agreement. She studied him then, not openly, not in a way that pressed, but with a kind of attention that noticed the small things, the way his shoulders held tension without showing it, the way his hands stayed still even when his eyes shifted, and after a few seconds, she gave a small exhale, almost a breath of recognition rather than judgment. "That kind of road does not end where you think it will," she said, and there was something in her tone, something lived rather than imagined, that made the words settle deeper than they should have. Ethan did not respond right away, not because he disagreed, but because he did not need to, the truth of it already sitting somewhere within him, and instead he took another slow drink from the cup, letting the warmth linger before setting it down beside him. The fire cracked softly, a single ember breaking free and fading into the dark, and beyond the circle of light, the land stretched out unseen, unchanged, waiting, and for the first time since he had left Red Hollow, Ethan did not feel the need to measure the distance ahead or behind, not because it had grown shorter, but because for a brief moment, sitting there beside a stranger who did not ask for answers. The weight of the road shifted just enough to remind him that not every truth needed to be carried alone. The fire burned lower as the night stretched on, its light softer now, more ember than flame, and the space between Ethan Cole and the woman seemed to settle into something quieter, not empty, not distant, but balanced, like two people who understood that words were not always the way forward. The wind shifted again, gentler this time, brushing across the camp and stirring the edge of the wagon canvas with a faint, restless sound. And Ethan's eyes moved briefly toward it, not out of suspicion, but out of habit, the kind that never quite leaves a man no matter how far he rides. The woman noticed the glance without turning her head, her attention still on the fire as she spoke. "You listen more than you speak," she said, her tone even, not a question, and Ethan gave the smallest nod, his voice following after a moment. "Listening tells you what people do not say." And the words settled between them with a weight that did not need explanation. She reached beside her and picked up a small object, something wrapped in cloth, turning it once in her hands before setting it back down near the wagon wheel, not hiding it, not showing it, just placing it where it belonged. And Ethan's gaze lingered there for a fraction longer than before, not because he recognized it, but because something about the care in that motion felt familiar, the way a person handles something that carries more than its size suggests. "You left something behind today," she said quietly, still not looking at him. And this time Ethan's stillness shifted just enough to be noticed, not outwardly, not in any movement that could be named, but in the way his breath paused before continuing, the way his shoulders held for a second longer than before, and when he answered, his voice was the same, calm, steady, but carrying something deeper beneath it. "Yes," he said, "nothing more, because anything more would have been too much." She nodded once, as if that was all she needed, and the silence returned. But it had changed, not heavier, not lighter, just clearer, like something unseen had been acknowledged without being pulled into the light. After a moment, she leaned forward slightly, adding another piece of wood to the fire, the flames rising just enough to cast a brighter glow across Ethan's face, and in that light, for the briefest second, something in his expression softened, not enough to call it relief, not enough to call it regret, just enough to suggest that whatever he had left behind had not been easy, even if it had been necessary. "People think leaving is the hard part," she said, her voice quiet against the sound of the fire. "It is not." And Ethan looked up again, his eyes steady on her, waiting, not for explanation, but for whatever truth she chose to place next, and she met his gaze for the first time fully, the firelight reflecting in her eyes as she finished. "It is what you carry after that decides everything." And the words stayed there, hanging in the air between them, not demanding response, not asking for agreement, just existing as something that did not need to be proven to be understood. Ethan did not answer right away, not because he did not have something to say, but because the truth in her words did not leave room for it. And instead he lowered his gaze back to the fire, watching the embers shift and settle, each small movement quiet and final. And somewhere beyond the circle of light, the land remained unchanged, wide and silent. But for the first time, it did not feel like something to escape, only something to cross, 1 mile at a time, carrying what could not be left behind. The fire had burned down to a steady glow, low and constant, the kind that no longer reached outward but held its warmth close. And Ethan Cole sat with his hands resting loosely on his knees, his posture unchanged, though something in the stillness around him had shifted, like the silence itself had grown more deliberate, more aware. The woman across from him leaned back slightly, her gaze lifting past the fire and into the dark beyond, as if she could see something out there that the night kept hidden from others. And for a moment neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing left to say, but because what remained did not belong to words spoken too quickly. The wind moved softly across the camp, brushing the edge of the wagon again, carrying with it a faint trace of dry grass and distant earth, and Ethan's eyes followed it briefly before returning to the fire, his attention settling once more on the slow shift of embers, each small collapse and flare marking time in a way that felt quieter than hours. "You did not leave just a place," the woman said after a while, her voice low, measured. "You left a version of yourself they will keep talking about." And Ethan did not look up right away, not because he disagreed, but because he understood the truth in it too clearly. The way a town holds onto a name long after the man who carried it has gone, shaping it into something easier to remember than the truth ever was. They will not look for what is missing, she continued, her tone steady. They will only repeat what they think they saw. And this time Ethan's gaze lifted, meeting hers across the dim light. His expression calm but edged with something quieter, something that did not push back, but did not fully accept either. That is how it stays simple, he said, and the words carried no bitterness, only recognition. She gave a slight nod, her eyes studying him again, not pressing, not probing, just seeing, and after a moment, she reached for the small, wrapped object again, this time unfolding the cloth just enough to reveal what lay inside. A simple metal badge, worn at the edges, its surface dulled by time and use. And she held it there for a second before setting it down between them, not offering it, not claiming it, just placing it where it could be seen. Ethan's gaze settled on it, and for the first time since he had arrived, something in his stillness shifted more noticeably, not outwardly, not in any sudden movement, but in the way his eyes held just a fraction longer, the way his breath slowed, as if the presence of that small object carried more weight than the miles he had already ridden. Someone left this near the ridge 2 days ago, she said quietly, did not stay to claim it. And the words settled into the space between them with a quiet certainty, not accusing, not questioning, just placing the truth where it could not be ignored. Ethan did not reach for the badge, did not move toward it at all. He only looked at it, the firelight catching the worn metal and reflecting faintly in his eyes. And after a moment, he spoke, his voice steady but softer than before. Then it belongs to the road now. And the answer carried something final in it, something that closed a door without needing to explain why. The woman watched him for a second longer, then folded the cloth back over the badge, covering it once more, not hiding it, just returning it to its place. And the fire shifted again, a small flare of light rising and fading, and beyond the camp, the night remained unchanged, wide and silent, holding its distance, while between them, something unspoken settled. Deeper, not resolved, not undone, just understood in a way that did not need to be carried any further than this moment. The night had settled into its quiet rhythm again, the fire reduced to a low circle of glowing embers that pulsed softly with each breath of wind, and Ethan Cole remained seated where he was, his gaze resting on that dim light, as if it held something more than warmth, something closer to understanding. The woman had not moved the cloth-wrapped badge again. It lay where she had set it, untouched, present but no longer central, like a truth that had already done its work and no longer needed to be spoken aloud. Somewhere beyond the edge of the camp, a faint sound carried through the dark, distant hoofbeats, slow and uneven, the kind that belonged to a tired horse rather than a hurried rider, and Ethan's head lifted slightly, not sharply, just enough to acknowledge it, the same quiet awareness he had carried since the first mile out of town. The woman heard it too, her eyes shifting toward the horizon, but she did not stand, did not reach for anything. She only listened, measuring the sound the way Ethan always did, and for a moment, the two of them sat in that shared awareness, the fire between them, the night, stretching outward, and something approaching that neither of them had called for. The hoofbeats grew clearer after a minute, still distant but steady, and then, slowly, a silhouette formed against the dark, a rider cresting a low rise about 50 yards out, the shape moving without urgency, guided more by endurance than intent. And when the figure came closer, the details began to settle into place. A man, older, his posture leaning slightly forward as if the weight of the ride had settled into his shoulders, his hat pulled low, his horse moving with that careful, measured step that comes after too many miles. Ethan did not stand, did not step forward. He remained where he was, but something in his stillness changed again, not tension, not readiness, just recognition, quiet and certain. The rider brought his horse to a stop just beyond the edge of the firelight, about 20 feet away, and for a few seconds, no one spoke. The three of them held in that same suspended moment, the kind that comes when the past arrives without announcement. Then the man lifted his head slightly, enough for the firelight to catch the lines of his face, and Ethan's eyes met his, steady and unreadable, and the older man exhaled slowly, the sound carrying more than words could have. Before he spoke, his voice worn but clear. "You always did ride too far before stopping." And the words settled into the space like something long expected. Not surprising, not sudden, just inevitable. Ethan did not answer right away, not because he did not have something to say, but because the distance between what had been and what stood here now did not close with a single sentence. And instead he held the man's gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, the same kind of nod he had given back in Red Hollow. But this time it carried something different, not acceptance, not surrender, something closer to acknowledgement. The woman watched them both without speaking, her presence steady, her attention sharp, and the fire flickered once, casting a brief, brighter light across all three of them before settling again. And in that moment, it became clear without being said that whatever truth had been left behind in town had not stayed there entirely. A part of it had followed, carried not by rumor or accusation, but by someone who had chosen to look beyond what was easy to believe, and now stood at the edge of the fire, waiting, not for confession, but for something quieter, something that did not need to be proven to be understood. The silence after the older man spoke did not feel empty. It felt measured, like something long carried had finally reached the point where it could be set down without breaking. And Ethan Cole remained where he was, his gaze steady, his posture unchanged, though something in the air between them had shifted, not tension, not relief, something quieter, something closer to truth finding its place. The older man guided his horse a few steps closer, just enough for the firelight to reach him fully, revealing Sheriff Halvorson's face beneath the brim of his hat, the same lines etched deep as before, but now carrying something heavier, something that had not been there when Ethan left town. And he dismounted slowly, his boots touching the ground with a weight that spoke of more than miles traveled. For a moment, he said nothing, just stood there, looking at Ethan the way a man looks at something he should have understood sooner. And then he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper, worn at the edges, creased more than once, and held it loosely in his hand without offering it yet. "It was not your shot," he said finally, his voice low but certain, not asking, not guessing, just stating what had taken too long to see. And the words did not rise, did not break the night. They settled into it, steady and final. Ethan's eyes did not shift, did not widen, he only listened, the same way he had listened to everything else. And the woman by the fire remained still, her presence quiet but attentive, the kind that did not interrupt, but did not miss anything either. Halvorson exhaled slowly, glancing down at the paper before continuing. Tracks did not match the ground where they said they did. Timing was wrong. And the man who swore he saw you, he changed his story when no one was listening. And he paused there, not because he lacked more to say, but because the truth did not need to be piled on once it had found its footing. Ethan lowered his gaze briefly then, not in shame, not in relief, just in acknowledgement, like a man hearing something he had already known but never intended to prove. "Town will want you back," Halvorson added after a moment, his tone quieter now. "They will say they made a mistake. They will say it can be fixed." And there was something in his voice, something that carried the weight of that offer, not as authority, but as a man who understood what it asked in return. Ethan looked up again, meeting his gaze, and for the first time since the sheriff had arrived, there was a faint shift in his expression, not enough to call it emotion, but enough to show that the words had reached somewhere deeper than before. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, steady, carrying no edge. "They did not make a mistake," he said, and the simplicity of it held more than any explanation could. Halvorson frowned slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition of something he was still trying to understand, and the fire between them flickered once, casting a brief, brighter light across the ground before settling again. "Then why?" the sheriff asked, not demanding, not pressing, just placing the question where it belonged. And Ethan did not answer right away, the silence stretching just long enough to matter, before he shifted his gaze briefly toward the wagon, toward the woman, then back to the sheriff. And in that small movement, something became clear without being spoken, something that connected what had been left behind with what stood here now. Halvorson followed that glance, his eyes narrowing slightly as he understood, not all of it, but enough. and he let out a quiet breath, the kind that comes when a man realizes the truth was never hidden, only placed where he had not thought to look. The night held steady around them. The fire low, the wind soft, and no one moved to break the moment, because some truths, once spoken, do not need to be argued. They only need to be accepted. And in that quiet space, it became clear that what Ethan had carried out of town had never been about guilt or innocence, but about something far harder to name, something that could not be returned with a simple apology and could not be undone by setting the record straight. The fire had almost gone out, leaving only a faint red glow that pulsed softly in the dark, and the three of them stood within its fading circle of light, the silence no longer uncertain, no longer waiting, but settled into something final, something that did not need to be spoken again. Sheriff Halvorsen remained where he was, the folded paper still in his hand, though its weight had clearly shifted. No longer evidence, no longer a solution, just a piece of truth that had arrived too late to change what mattered. And he looked at Ethan Cole with a quiet understanding that had not been there before, the kind that comes when a man realizes that fixing something on paper does not fix what was chosen in silence. Ethan stood slowly, not with urgency, not with hesitation, just rising as if the moment had reached its natural end, his movements calm, deliberate, and when he stepped forward, it was not toward the sheriff, but slightly past him, toward the open land beyond the edge of the firelight, the same direction he had been moving since the beginning. Halvorsen turned slightly as Ethan passed, his voice low, almost a question, but not quite. "You could come back." And the words carried no authority now, only the weight of what they offered, a return, a correction, a chance to place things where they should have been from the start. Ethan paused for a second, not turning around, not fully stopping, just enough to let the words reach him, and in that brief stillness, the night seemed to hold its breath again, waiting for something that would not come the way it expected. They would still need a story, Ethan said quietly, his voice steady, carrying just enough to reach both of them, just a different one. And there was no bitterness in it, no judgment, only a simple truth laid down as plainly as everything else he had said. The sheriff exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that comes when a man understands that some things cannot be brought back, not because they are lost, but because they were never meant to return, and he gave a small nod, not to Ethan's back, but to the truth itself, accepting it in a way that required no agreement. The woman by the wagon remained still, watching without interruption, her presence unchanged, steady as the land around them, and for a moment her eyes met Ethan's again as he turned slightly, not a farewell, not a promise, just a quiet recognition of something shared, something that did not need to be carried any further than this place. The wind moved softly across the camp, brushing the last of the warmth from the fire as the embers dimmed, and Ethan reached for his horse, loosening the reins with the same calm precision, his hand resting briefly against the animal's neck before he mounted, the leather creaking softly in the quiet. He did not look back when he settled into the saddle, did not wait for another word, because everything that needed to be said had already been placed where it belonged, and as he guided the horse forward, the sound of hooves faded slowly into the open night, steady, unhurried, carrying him beyond the reach of the firelight, beyond the reach of the town that would one day learn the truth, but never understand the choice. Sheriff Halvorsen stood there for a long moment after, the folded paper still in his hand, before he finally tucked it away, not as something to present, but as something to remember. And when he turned back toward the dying fire, the badge wrapped in cloth lay where it had been left, quiet, unclaimed, and he did not pick it up, did not try to return it, because some things, once set down, are not meant to be carried again. The night closed in gently around the empty space Ethan had left behind, the stars steady above, the land unchanged, and in that quiet, there was no victory, no loss, only a truth that had found its place without needing to be spoken aloud, the kind that lingers long after the story has been told, not in words, but in the silence that follows.